The world watched with a held breath, caught in the tense silence between Washington's audacious ultimatum and Moscow's anticipated reply. The secret mission of Stephen Witkoff, President Trump's personal envoy, had become the subject of frenzied global speculation. Financial markets hung in suspense, and military commands from the Baltic to the Black Sea remained on high alert. The August 8th deadline delivered by Witkoff loomed like a guillotine, a stark date by which the Kremlin was expected to respond to a choice between a controversial peace proposal and complete economic isolation. Into this charged atmosphere of anticipation, President Vladimir Putin chose not to send a quiet diplomatic note or a discreet signal through the back channel Trump had established. Instead, he seized the global stage in a meticulously choreographed address from the opulent St. George Hall of the Grand Kremlin Palace, and even designed not to answer Trump's question, but to fundamentally rewrite it. He countered the American deadline not with an answer, but with a declaration, a sweeping pronouncement of Russia's historical and sacred goals from which he made clear there could be no retreat. Putin's address, a declaration of unyielding principle in a televised speech delivered to a hand-picked audience of Russia's political, military, and spiritual elite, President Putin presented a vision that deliberately transcended the immediate crisis in Ukraine. He spoke not as a politician weighing options, but as a historical figure entrusted with a national destiny. He began by acknowledging the nervous signals and unconventional proposals coming from Western capital, dismissing them as the product of a fundamental inability to comprehend the soul of Russia. He then pivoted to what he framed as the core, non-negotiable pillars of Russian state policy, repeatedly using the phrase, "the most important thing," to underscore each point as an article of faith rather than a subject for negotiation. His performance was a masterful act of political theater, aimed at his domestic audience to steal them from the common hardship, at the global south to position himself as a challenger to American dominance, and at Washington to demonstrate that its economic threats were targeting a nation that believed it was fighting for its very existence. Goal number one, an indivisible and guaranteed security. Putin declared that Russia's first and most paramount objective was the establishment of a new, legally binding security architecture for the entire European continent. For 30 years, he stated, his voice resonating with cold anger, we have patiently pointed out that the security of one nation cannot be built upon the insecurity of another. The endless expansion of a hostile military bloc toward our border was a promise broken and a dagger pointed at the heart of our statehood. He made it clear that any settlement must include an absolute, permanent, and verifiable guarantee that Ukraine and other former Soviet states would never become members of the NATO alliance. He framed this not as a demand, but as the correction of a historic wrong. The most important thing is the physical safety of our people and our state, he proclaimed. We will not live with a gun to our temple. We will not allow our historic lands to be used as a staging ground for an attack on Moscow. This is not a negotiating position. It is the foundational requirement for our survival. Any discussion that does not begin with this reality is a discussion with ourselves in a room of mirrors. He was drawing a line in the sand, defining Russia's action not as aggression, but as the forceful establishment of a security perimeter it viewed as essential and long denied. Goal number two, the protection of a unified civilization. The Russian president then moved into more ethereal and emotional territory, speaking of a spiritual and civilizational mission. He painted the conflict as a tragic but necessary intervention to protect millions of people whom he described as intrinsically linked to Russia by language, faith, and blood. For centuries, we were one people, one whole, he said, invoking a shared history that Western leaders often dismiss, but that forms the core of his nationalist appeal. To see this unity torn asunder by foreign interests, to see our language banned, our churches seized, and our people threatened with cultural erasure, is a wound that no true Russian patriot can ignore. He declared that Russia would never abandon these populations and that their security and right to self-determination, as he defined it, was a sacred duty. The most important thing is to protect our people from persecution and to ensure they can live with dignity, speaking their own language and practicing their own faith without fear. This directly countered the Western framing of the war as an unprovoked land grab. Putin was presenting it as a grand act of national rescue, a mission to reunite a divided people, thereby giving a moral and historical justification for the territorial gains his military had achieved on the ground. This part of the speech was a clear signal that the territories currently under Russian control were not bargaining chips. Goal number 3, forging a just, multipolar world order. Finally, Putin broadened his focus to the entire global system, articulating a vision that went far beyond the border of Ukraine. He positioned Russia not merely as a regional power, but as the vanguard of a global rebellion against a unipolar world dominated by the United States. He spoke directly to leaders in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, casting the conflict in Ukraine as a primary front in a larger struggle for national sovereignty. The era of one country's domination is over, he declared with finality. The world is tired of being told how to live, who to trade with, and what values to adopt by a self-appointed hegemon that cloaks its own interests in the language of universal rules. He promised that Russia would work with all nations who sought a more equitable world order based on international law, not a rule-based order where the rules are written and rewritten at will in Washington. The most important thing is to restore a true balance of power, where every civilization and every sovereign nation has a voice and its legitimate interests are respected. We are fighting in Ukraine not just for Russia's future, but for a future where dictate is replaced by dialogue. This was a direct challenge to President Trump's America First worldview, suggesting that any deal would have to acknowledge a diminished global role for the United States. Washington's reaction, vindication, frustration, and alarm. As Putin's speech was broadcast, an emergency session of the National Security Council was convened in the White House Situation Room. The reaction was a perfect reflection of the deep division that had plagued the administration since the crisis began. For Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the speech was a moment of grim vindication. He reportedly turned to President Trump and stated flatly that Putin's words were proof of everything he had been arguing for weeks. He is not interested in a deal, Mr. President, Rubio was said to have argued. He is interested in surrender. He has just laid out a manifesto for a new Russian empire. His goals are limitless and fundamentally incompatible with American interests and the security of our allies. He's telling us that sanctions will not deter him and that diplomacy is a waste of time. He only understands forces. Rubio insisted that the speech should be seen as the final nail in the coffin of the Witkoff mission and that the only remaining option was to immediately unleash the full might of American military aid to Ukraine, including the long-range weapons needed to make Putin feel the cost of his ideology on the battlefield. A different kind of gloom settled over the economic contingent. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick watched as Putin effectively told the Russian people to brace for the very economic war they had designed. Putin's framing of the conflict as an existential struggle was a clear attempt to inoculate his population against the coming hardship, making it far less likely that economic pain would translate into immediate political pressure. Their powerful weapon of sanctions, designed for a rational actor, was now being aimed at an opponent who had just declared himself to be on a holy mission. They understood that their strategy could still work over the long run, but Putin's speech had dramatically shortened the odds that it would produce a result before the August 8th deadline, making the prospect of actually having to implement the measures with all their attendant risk to the global economy far more likely. President Trump himself was reportedly quiet and difficult to read, watching the speech with an intense focus. His initial reaction was one of anger that Putin had not engaged directly with the terms of his secret offer. He saw it as a public snub, an attempt by the Russian leader to dictate the terms of the conversation. Yet some aides noted that Trump, the ultimate showman, also seemed to recognize and perhaps even respect the audacity of Putin's performance. He saw a strong leader projecting an image of unshakable resolve. The speech did not give him the simple yes or no his deal-making instinct desired. Instead, it presented him with a far more complex challenge. Putin had not just rejected an offer, he had made a grand counteroffer to the entire world, framing his war aims as noble and just. The August 8th deadline was still ticking, but Putin's declaration had fundamentally altered the stakes. To unleash the sanctions now would be to engage in a battle of economic attrition against an adversary who had just announced he was prepared to endure anything. To accept Putin's framework would be to concede to the very terms that his own Secretary of State had just branded a manifesto for a new Russian empire. The back-channel gambit, designed to find a simple path out of the war, had now led to a moment of profound and dangerous clarity. Many of my listeners, like 70%, haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, and so many of you don't even know that you haven't subscribed. That is actually what makes the show going. It's almost like you're making a donation to the show. So that's why I ask again and again, because it enables us to grow and grow and grow. And we're going for the long haul here. And listen, if this is your first time listening to World Global Conflict, you don't have to subscribe. You guys, your first one's on me. But if you have watched this show before, it's like you are a freeloader now. So all I would ask you is, if you have seen this show before and you like it, help me, help my team here. Hit that subscribe and like button now, and we will continue to build the show for you. That I swear. Thank you to all of you guys who have subscribed. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. That's all for me for today. I will see you soon. Bye for now.